Alrighty, we'll go live or we'll start in just a minute. Hope everyone's having a lovely evening. I know I am so far. Let's over here real quick. Here we go. Hi. Just let everybody show up and then we'll start reading. Hey Yoko, hey Super, how's it going? I'm going quite well. Just giving the people a little bit of time before I start the reading for tonight. We're doing Shadow over Innsmouth Part 2. It'll be interesting. Oh gosh. I'm not supposed to speak Spanish, Yoko. Oh, it's my favorite octopus. I am well, super. Bien. Muy bien. ¿Cómo está? Hey, Savage, how you doing tonight? I don't know how excited you want to. Super is our friend from Mexico. He speaks mainly Spanish, but he still comes by and he's been very kind. You know, if they say that lasts 4 hours, Savage, that you should see the doctor. You are the medium of TF2. What's that mean? That's nice of you. That is the fat man and his amigos? Hmm. I don't know what that means. I guess I could limit myself. I, oh, did it say doctor? I think it says doctor. Oh, yeah, the medic. He mean, is TF Titanfall? I think he means he's the medic in Titanfall 2. I think Team Fortress? Okay, I'm being informed that TF2 is in fact Team Fortress 2. I haven't played Titanfall or Team Fortress, thus I would not know this. That is very cool, medic. That explains the name. Actually. That grouper. Ah, okay. Well, now we know a little more about you. All right. Now we're going to start reading. We are at part 3. I'm going to drink some of this nasty ass tea, which I forgot to bring up last time. Hold on. It says that grouper, whatever that means. No. This is throat coat so that while I'm reading, my throat doesn't fall apart on me. All right. I'm going to turn my keyboard off and move it so that it's out of my way. Forgot to do that. Otherwise, I get tempted to rest my book on it. That always turns out poorly. Let me turn on the background music so that y'all can hear it. Let me know if anything's too loud or anything, or too quiet or whatever. All right, here we go. It must have been some imp of the perverse or sardonic pull from dark hidden sources, which made me change my plans as I did. I had long before resolved to limit my observations to architecture alone, and I was even then hurrying towards the square in an effort to get quick transportation out of this festering city of death and decay. But the sight of old Zadok Allen set up new currents in my mind and made me slacken my pace uncertainly. I had been assured that the old man could do nothing but hint at wild, disjointed, and incredible legends, and I had been warned that the natives made it unsafe to be seen talking to him. Yet the thought of this aged witness to the town's decay, with memories going back to the early days of ships and factories, was a lure that no amount of reason could make me resist. After all, the strangest and maddest of myths are often merely symbols or allegories based upon truth. And old Zadok must have seen everything which went on around Innsmouth for the last 90 years. Curiosity flared up beyond sense and caution, and in my youthful egotism, I fancied I might be able to sift a nucleus of real history from the confused, extravagant outpouring I would probably extract with the aid of raw whiskey. I knew that I could not accost him then and there, for the firemen would surely notice and object. Instead, I reflected, I would prepare by getting some bootleg liquor at a place where the grocery boy had told me it was plentiful. Then I would loaf near the fire station in apparent casualness and fall in with old Zadok after he had started on one of his frequent rambles. The youth had said he was very restless, seldom sitting around the fire station for more than an hour or two at a time. A quart bottle of whiskey was easily, though not cheaply, obtained in the rear of a dingy variety store just off the square in Elliott Street. The dirty-looking fellow who waited on me had a touch of the staring Innsmouth look, but was quite civil in his way, being perhaps used to the custom of such convivial strangers, truckmen, gold buyers, and the like, as were occasionally in town. Re-entering the square, I saw that luck was with me, for shuffling out of Payne Street, around the corner of the Gilman house, I glimpsed nothing less than the tall, lean, tattered form of old Zadok Allen himself. In accordance with my plan, I attracted his attention by brandishing my newly purchased bottle, and soon realized that he had begun to shuffle wistfully after me as I turned into Waite Street on my way to the most deserted region I could think of. I was steering my course by the map the grocery boy had prepared, and was aiming for the wholly abandoned stretch of southern waterfront which I had previously visited. The only people in sight there had been the fishermen on the distant breakwater, and by going a few squares south, I could get beyond the range of these, finding a pair of seats on some abandoned wharf, and being free to question old Zadok unobserved for an indefinite time. Before I reached Main Street, I could hear a faint and wheezy, "Hey, mister," behind me, and I presently allowed the old man to catch up and take copious pulls from the quart bottle. I began putting out feelers as we walked along to Water Street, and turned southward amidst the omnipresent desolation and crazily tilted ruins, but found that the aged tongue did not loosen as quickly as I had expected. At length I saw a grass-grown opening towards the sea between crumbling brick walls, with the weedy lengths of an earth and masonry wharf projecting beyond. Piles of moss-covered stones near the water promised tolerable seats, and the scene was sheltered from all possible view by a ruined warehouse on the north. Here, I thought, was the ideal place for a long, secret colloquy. So I guided my companion down the lane and picked out spots to sit in among the mossy stones. The air of death and desertion was ghoulish, and the smell of fish almost insufferable, but I was resolved to let nothing deter me. About 4 hours remained for conversation if I were to catch the 8 o'clock coach for Arkham, and I began to dole out more liquor to the ancient tippler, meanwhile eating my own frugal lunch. In my donations, I was careful not to overshoot the mark, for I did not wish Zadok's vinous garrulousness to pass into a stupor. After an hour, his furtive taciturnity shewed signs of disappearing, but much to my disappointment, he still sidetracked my questions about Innsmouth and its shadow-haunted past. He would babble of current topics, revealing a wide acquaintance with newspapers and a great tendency to philosophize in a sententious village fashion. Towards the end of the second hour, I feared my quart of whiskey would not be enough to produce results, and was wondering whether I had better leave old Zadok and go back for more. Just then, however, chance made the opening which my questions had been unable to make. The wheezing ancient's rambling took a turn that caused me to lean forward and listen alertly. My back was towards the fishy-smelling sea, but he was facing it, and something or other had caused his wandering gaze to light on the low, distant line of Devil Reef, then shewing plainly and almost fascinatingly above the waves. The sight seemed to displease him, for he began a series of weak curses which ended in a confidential whisper and a knowing leer. He bent towards me, took hold of my coat lapel, and hissed out some hints that could not be mistaken. "Thar's where it all begun. That cursed place of all wickedness, where the deep water starts. Gate of hell. Sheer drop down to a bottom o' no sounding like Kentucky. Old Cap'n Obed done it. Him that found out more was good for him. in the South Sea Islands. Everybody was in a bad way them days. Trade falling off, mills losing business, even the new ones. And the best of our menfolk killed a privateer in the War of 1812, or lost with the Esley bringing in the Ranger snow, both on 'em Gilman venters. Obed Marsh, he had 3 ships afloat, Brigandine Colby, Brig Hetty, and a bark, Sumatra Queen. He was the only one as kept 'em on with the East Indian and Pacific trade, though Edris Martin Barkentide, Malay Pride, made a venter as late as 28. Never was nobody like Captain Obed, old limpin' old Satan. Heh, I can mind him a-tellin' about furrin parts and callin' all the folks stupid for going to Christian meetin' and bearin' their burdens meek and lowly. Says they orter get better gods like some of them folks in the Ingies. God as would bring 'em good fishin' in return for their sacrifices and in really answerin' folks' prayers. Matt Elliott, his first mate, talked a lot too, only he was again folks doing any heathen things. Told about an island east of Otaheite, where there was a lot of stone ruins, older than anybody knew anything about, kind of like them on Pompeii, the Carolinas, but with the carvings of faces that looked like big statues on Easter Island. There was little volcanic island near there too, where there was other ruins with different carvings. Ruins all wore away, like they'd been under sea once, and with pictures of awful monsters all over 'em. Well, sir, Matt says the natives around there had all the fishes they could catch, and sported bracelets and armlets and head rigs made out of a queer kind of gold and covered with pictures of monsters just like the ones carved over the ruins on the little island. Sort of fish like frogs or frog-like fishes that was drawed in all kinds of positions like they was human beings. None could get out of them where they got the stuff, and all the other natives wondered how they managed to find fish in plenty, even when the very next island had lean pickings. Matt, he got to wondering too, and so did Captain Obed. Obed, he notices, besides, that lots of the handsome young menfolk could drop out of sight for good from year to year, and that there weren't many folk around. Also, he thinks some of the folk look darn queer, even for Kanakis. It took Obed to get the truth out of them heathens. I don't know how he done it, but he begun by trading for the gold-like things they wore. Asked them where they come from, and if they could get more, and finally wormed the story out of the old chief. Wallachia, they called him. Nobody but Obed had ever believed the old yeller devil, but Cap'n could read folk like they was a book. Nobody never believes me now when I tell 'em, and I don't suppose you will, young fella. Though come to look at you have kind of got them same sharp reading eyes like Obed had. The old man's whispers grew fainter, and I found myself shuddering at the terrible and sincere portentousness of his intonation, even though I knew his tale could be nothing but drunken fantasy. Well, sir, Obed, he learnt that they's things on this earth as most folk ain't ne'er heard about, and wouldn't believe if they did hear. It seemed these Kanakis was sacrificing heaps of their young men and maiden to some kind of god thing that lived under the sea, and getting all kinds of favors in return. They met the things on the little islet with the queer ruins, and it seems them an awful picture of fish frog monsters was supposed to be pictures of these things. Maybe they was the kind of critters as got all them mermaid stories and sich started. They had all kinds of cities on the sea bottom, and this island was heaved up from there. Seems they was some kind of things alive in the stone buildings when the islands come up sudden to the surface. That's how the Kanakis got wind they was down there. Made sign talk as soon as they got over being skirt and pieced up a bargain for the long. Them things liked human sacrifices. Had 'em ages afore, but lost track of the upper world hour of time. What they done to the victims, it ain't for me to say, and I guess Obed wasn't none too sharp about asking. But it was all right with the heathens because they'd been having a hard time and was desperate about everything. They gave a certain number of young folk to the sea things twice every year, May Eve and Halloween, regular as could be. Also gave 'em some of the carved knickknacks they made. What the things agreed to give in return was plenty of fish. They drove 'em in from all over the sea, and a few gold things now and then. Well, as I says, the natives met the things on the little volcanic islet, going there in canoes with sacrifices, etc., and bringing back any of the gold like jewels as was coming to 'em. At first, the things didn't never go on to the mainland, but after a time, they come to want to. Seems the hankering our mix with the folks and having joint ceremonies on the big days, May Eve and Halloween. You see, they was able to live both in and out of the water, what they call amphibians, I guess. And the Kanakis told 'em as how folks from the other islands might want to wipe 'em out if they got wind of their being there. But they says they don't care much, because they could wipe out the whole brood of humans if they was willing to bother. That is, any as didn't have certain signs such as was used onst by the lost old ones, whoever they was. But not wanting to bother, they'd lay low when anybody visited the island. When it comes to mating with them toad-looking fishes, the Kakanakis kind of balked. But finally they learnt something as put a new face on the matter. Seems that human folks has kinda got a relation to such water beasts. That everything alive come out of the water once and only needs a little bit of change to go back again. Them things told the Kanakis that if they mixed blood, there'd be children as would look human at first, but later turn more and more like the things, till finally they'd take to the water and join the main lot of them down there. And this is the important part, young feller. Them is turned into fishes things and went down in the water wouldn't never die. Them things never died, except they was killed by violence. Well, sir, it seemed by the time Obed knowed them islanders, they was all full of fish blood from them deep water things. When they got old and begun to chew it, they was kept hid till they felt like taking to the water or quitting the place. Some was more touched than others, and some never did change quite enough to take to the water. But mostly they turned out just the way them things said. Them was born more like the things changed early. But them as was nearly human sometimes stayed on the island till they was past 70. Though they'd usually go down under for trial trips afore that. Folks as had took to the water generally come back a good deal to visit. So's a man often be a-talking to his own 5 times great-grandfather who'd left the dry land a couple 100 years or so afore. I apologize for the horrible accent. I'm doing my best. Everybody got out of the idea of dying, except in the canoe wars with the other islanders, or as sacrifices to the sea gods down below, or from snake bite, or plague, or sharp galloping alien ailments, or something afore they could take to the water. But simply look forward to a kind of change that wasn't a bit horrible after a while. They thought what they got was well with all they had to give up, and I guess Obed kind of came to think of himself when he chewed over the old Wallaki story a bit. Wallaki, though, was one of the few as hadn't gotten none of the fish blood, being of a royal line that intermarried with royal lines on other islands. Wallaki, he showed Obed a lot of rites and incantations as had to do with the sea things, and let him see some of the folks in the village as had changed a lot from human shape. Somehow or other, though, he never would let him see one of the regular things from right out the water. In the end, he gave him a kind of funny thingamajig and made him out of lead or something that'd bring up the fish things from any place in the water where there might be a nest of them. The idea was to drop it down to the right kind with the right kind of prayer and sish. Wallaki allowed as the things was scattered all over the world, so as anybody that looked about could find a nest and bring 'em up if they was wanted. Matt, he didn't like this business at all, and wanted Obed should keep away from the island. But Captain was sharp for gain, and found he could get them gold-like things so cheap it'd pay him to make a specialty of 'em. Things went on that way for years, and Obed got enough of that gold-like stuff to make him start the refinery in Waite's old run-down fulling mill. He didn't dast sell the pieces the way they was, for folks to be asking all the time questions. All the same, his crew'd get a piece and dispose of it now and then, even though they was swore to keep quiet, and he let his women folk wear some of the pieces, as was more human-like than most. Well, come about 38, when I was 7 years old, Obed, he found the people all wiped out about between voyages. Seems the other islanders got wind of what was going on, and it took matters in their own hands. Suppose they must have had, arter all, them old magic signs, as the sea thing says, was the only thing they was afeard of. No tellin' what any of them Kanaki's will chance to get a hold of when the sea bottom throws up some island with ruins and older in the deluge. Pious cusses. These was, they didn't leave nothin' standin' on either the main island or the little volcanic islet, except what parts of the ruins was too big to knock down. In some places, there was little stones strewed about, like charms with something on 'em like what ye call a swastika nowadays. Probably them was the old one signs. Folks all wiped out. No trace of gold-like things, and none of the nearby Kanekis would bring a word about the matter. Wouldn't even admit they'd ever been any people on that island. That naturally hit Obed pretty hard, seeing as his normal trade was doing very poor. It hit the whole of Innsmouth, too, because in the seafaring days what profited the master of a ship generally profited the crew proportionate. Most of the folks around the town now took the hard times kind of sheep-like and resigned, but they was in a bad shape because the fishing was petering out around the mills and wasn't doing none too well. Fred, that is a hilarious statement. And yes, I would. Hey, Bublito. We're doing good. Reading a story with a terrible accent. Bub, you don't speak Spanish, do you? No, you're Canadian. You speak French. Okay. Oof. Then's the time Obed he began a cursin' at the folks for being dull sheep and praying to a Christian heaven as didn't help him none. He told 'em he'd knowed of folks as prayed to gods that give him something you really need, and says if a good bunch of men 'ud stand beside him, he could maybe get a holt of some sartin powers 'ud bring him plenty of fish in it and quite a bit of gold. Of course, them as served on the Sumatra Queen and seed the island knowed what he meant, and it wasn't none too anxious to get close to the sea things they'd heard tell on. But them as didn't know what 'twas about got kind of swayed by what Obed had to say, and begun to ask him what he could do to set him on the way to the faith as 'd bring him results. Here the old man faltered, mumbled, and lapsed into a moody and apprehensive silence, glancing nervously over his shoulder and then turning back to stare fascinatedly at the distant black reef. When I spoke to him, he did not answer, so I knew I would have to let him finish the bottle. The insane yarn I was hearing interested me profoundly, for I fancied there was contained within it a sort of crude allegory based upon the strangenesses of Innsmouth, and elaborated by an imagination at once creative and full of scraps of exotic legend. Not for a moment did I believe that the tale had any real substantial foundation, but nonetheless the account held a hint of genuine terror, if only because it brought in references to strange jewelry clearly akin to the malign tiara I had seen at Newburyport. Perhaps the ornaments had, after all, come from some strange island, and possibly the wild stories were lies of the bygone Obed himself, rather than of this antique toper. I handed Zadok the bottle, and he drained it to the last drop. It was curious how he could stand so much whiskey, for not even a trace of thickness had come into his high, wheezy voice. He licked the nose of the bottle and slipped it into his pocket, then beginning to nod and whisper softly to himself. I bent close to catch any articulate words he might utter, and thought I saw a sardonic smile behind the stained, bushy whiskers. Yes, he was really forming words, and I could grasp a fair proportion of them. Poor Matt. He was always agin it. Tried to line up the folk on his side and had long talks with the preachers. No use. They run the congressional parson out of town, and the Methodist feller quit. Never did see Resolve Babcock, the Baptist parson, again. Wraith of Jehovah. I was a mighty little critter, but I heard what I heard, and I seen what I seen. Dagoth and Nazareth, Belial and Beelzebub, golden calf, and the idols of Canaan and the Philistines, Babylonian abomination, mene, tekel, a parson. He stopped again, and from the look in his watery blue eyes, I feared he was close to a stupor after all. But when I gently shook his shoulder, he turned on me with astonishing alertness and snapped out of some of the most obscure phrases. Don't believe me, hey? Then just tell me, young feller, why Cap'n Obed and 20-odd other folks used to row out to Devil Reef in the dead of night and chant things so loud you could hear 'em all over town when the wind was right. Tell me that, hey? And tell me why Obed was always dropping heavy things down into the deep water on the other side of the reef, where the bottom shoots down like a cliff lower than you can sound. Tell me what he done with that funny-shaped lead thingamajig as Wally K gave him. Hey, boy, and what did they all howl on May Eve and again next Halloween? And why did the new church parsons, fellers as used to be sailors, wear them quib robes and cover theirselves with them gold-like things Obed brung, hey? The watery blue eyes were almost savage and maniacal now, and the dirty white beard bristled electrically. Old Zadok probably saw me shrink back, for he began to cackle evilly. Beginning to see, eh? Maybe you'd like to have been me in them days when I'd see things at night out to fish from the cupola of my house. Oh, I can tell ye, little pitchers have big ears, and I wasn't missing nothing of what the gossiped about Captain Obed and the folk about the reef. How about the night I took my pa's ship, glassed up to the cupola, and seen the reed a bristling thick with shapes that drove off quick, soon as the moon riz. Obed and the folk was in a dory, But them shapes stove off the far side of the deep water and never come up. How'd you like to be a little shaver, alone in a cupola watching shapes as wasn't human shapes, eh? The old man was getting hysterical, and I began to shiver with a nameless alarm. He laid a gnarled claw on my shoulder, and it seemed to me that its shaking was not altogether that of mirth. Suppose one night you seed something heavy heaved off Obed's door beyond the reef, and then larn the next day a young feller was missing from home, hey? Did you ever see Hide No Hair or Hiram Grilm again? Did they? And Nick Pierce and Lily White and Adoniram Southwick and Henry Garrison, hey? Shapes taking sign language with their hands, them as had real hands. Well, sir, that was the time Obed begun to get on his feet again. Folks see his 3 daughters a-wearing gold things as nobody'd seen 'em afore, and smoke started coming out of the refinery chimney. Other folks was prospering too. Fish begun to swarm into the harbor fit to kill, and heaven knows what sized cargoes we begun to ship out to Newburyport, Arkham, and Boston. 'Twas then Obed got the Old Branch Railroad put through. Some Kingsport fishermen heard about the catch and came up in sloops, but they was all lost. Nobody e'er see 'em again. And just then our folks organized the Esoteric Order of Dagon and bought Masonic Hall off in Cavalry Commandery for it. Matt Elliott was a Mason and again the selling, but he dropped out of sight just then. Remember, I ain't saying Obed was set on having things just like they was on that Kanaki Island. I don't think he aimed at first to do no mixin', nor raise no young'uns to take to the water and turn into fishes with eternal life. He wanted them gold things and was willing to pay heavy, and I guess the others was satisfied for a while. Comin' 46 and the town was looking and thinking for itself. Too many folks mixin'. Too much wild preachin' at meeting of Sunday. Too much talk about the reef. I guess I done a bit by tellin' Selectman Maury what I seen from the cupola. There was a party one night as followed Obed's crowd out to the reef, and I heard shots betwixt the dories. Next day, Obed and 32 of the others were in jail, with everybody a-wondering just what was afoot, and just what charge against them could be got to Holt. God, if anybody'd look ahead. A couple of weeks later, when nothing had been thrown into the sea for that long. Zadok was showing signs of fright and exhaustion, and I let him keep silence for a while, though glancing apprehensively at my watch. The tide had turned and was coming in now, and the sound of the waves seemed to arouse him. I was glad of that tide, for at high water the fishy smell might not be so bad. Again I strained to catch his whispers. That awful night I seed 'em. I was up in the cupola, hordes of 'em, swarms of 'em, all over the reef and swimming up the harbor into the Minuet. God, what happened in the streets of Innsmouth that night? They rattled our door, but Pa wouldn't open. Then he clumb out the kitchen window with his musket to find Selectman Maury and see what he could do. Mounds of the dead and dying, shots and screaming, shouting in the old square and town square and New Church Green, jail throwed open, proclamation treason, called it the plague when the folks came in and found half our people missing. Nobody left, but just as joined with Obed and them things or else kept quiet. Never heard of my pa no more. The old man was panting and perspiring profusely. His grip on my shoulder tightened. Everything cleaned up in the morning, but there was traces. Obed, he kind of take charge and said things gonna change. Others'll worship with us at meeting times, and certain houses has got to entertain guests. They want to mix like they done with the Kanakis, and he, for one, didn't feel bound to stop 'em. Far gone was Obed, just like a crazy man on the subject. He said they brung us fish and treasure, and should have whatever they hankered arter. Oh God, that was a funny sound. Nothing was to be different on the outside. Only we was to keep shy as strangers if we knowed what was good for us. We'd all had to take the oath Dagon, and later on there was a second and a third oath that some on us took. These that help get special rewards, gold and such. No use balking, for there was millions of 'em down there. They'd rather not start rising and wiping out humankind, but if they was give away and forced to, they could do a lot toward just that. We didn't have them old charms to cut 'em off like the folks in the South Sea did, and the Kanakis would never give away their secrets. Yield up enough sacrifices and savage knickknacks and harborage in the town when they wanted it, and they'd let well enough known. Wouldn't bother no strangers and might bear tales outside, that is without they got prying. All in the band of the faithful, order of Dagon, and the children should never die, but go back to the Mother Hydra and Father Dagon, what we all come from once. I Cthulhu Fatagan, Fignoit Banyak, Cthulhu Relay Wagna Fatsagan. I really need to practice that line more. Old Zadak was fast lapsing into stark raving, and I held my breath. Poor old soul. To what pitiful depths of hallucination had his liquor, plus the hatred of the decay, alienage, and disease around him, brought that fertile, imaginative brain? He began to moan now, and tears were coursing down his channeled cheeks into the depths of his beard. God, when I seen sent I was 15 years old. Mene tickle a parson. The folks as was missing, and them as kilt themselves, them as told things in Arkham or Ipswich or sich places was all called crazy, like you are calling me right now. But God, what I'd seen. And they'd kilt me long ago for what I know. Only I took the first and second oaths of Dagon off an Obed. So was protected, less than a jury of 'em proved I told things knowing and deliberate. But I wouldn't take the third oath. I'd have died rather than take that. It got worse around the Civil War, when children born sent to 46 begun to grow up. Some of 'em, that is. As I feared. Never did no praying out of that awful night, and I never seen one of them close in all my life. That is, never no full-blooded one. I went to the war, and if I'd had any guests or sense, I'd have never come back, but settled away from here. But folks wrote me things wasn't so bad. That I was supposed was because the government draft men was in town hour 63. Arter the war, it was just as bad again. People begun to fall off, mills and shops shut down, shipping stopped and the harbor choked up, railroad give up, but they never stopped swimming in and out of the harbor from that cursed reef of Satan, and more attic winders got boarded up, and more noises were heard in houses as wasn't supposed to have nobody in 'em. Folks outside have their stories about us. Suppose you heard plenty of 'em on seeing what questions you asked. Stories about things they'd seed now and then, and about that queer jewelry is what comes in from somewheres and ain't quite all melted up, but nothing never gets definite. Nobody'll believe nothing. They call them gold things like pirate loot, and allow the Innsmouth folk his fern blood, or is distempered or something. Besides, them that lives here shoes off as many strangers as they can, and encourage the rest not to get very curious, especially around night times. Beasts balk at the critters. Hosses, wuss, and mules. But when they got autos, that was all right. In 46, Captain Obed took a second wife that nobody in town never see. Some says he didn't want to, but was made to by them as he called in. Had 3 children by her. 2 has disappeared young, but one gal as looked like anybody else was educated in Europe. Finally, Obed got her married off by a trick to an Arkham feller as didn't suspect nothin'. But nobody outside'll have nothing to do with Innsmouth folk now. Barnabas Marsh, that runs the refinery now, and Obed's grandson by his first wife, son of the honest forest, the eldest son, but his mother was another of them, as wasn't never seen outdoors. Right now, Barnabas is about changed. Can't shit his eyes no more, and is all out of shape. They say he still wears clothes, but he'll take it to the water soon. Maybe he's tried it already. They do sometimes go down for little spells afore they go for good. Ain't never been seed about in public for nigh on 10 years. Dunno how his poor wife could feel. She came from Ipswich, and they nigh lynched Barnabas when he courted her 50-odd years ago. Obed, he died in 78, and the next generation is gone now. His first wife's children dead, and the rest, God knows. The sounds of the incoming tide was now very insistent, and little by little it seemed to change the old man's mood from maudlin tearfulness to watchful fear. He would pause now and then to renew those nervous glances over his shoulder, or out towards the reef, and despite the wild absurdity of his tale, I could not help begin to share his vague apprehensiveness. Zadok now grew shriller, and seemed to be trying to whip up his courage with louder speech. "Hey, you, why don't you say something? How'd you like to be living in a town like this, with everything a-rotting and a-dying and a boarded-up monster crawling and bleating and barking and hopping around black cellars and attics every which way you turn? Hey, how'd you like to hear the howling a night after night and from the churches in order of Dagon Hall, and you know what's going down part of the howling? How'd you like to hear what comes from that awful reef every May Eve and Halloween's Mass? Hey, the old man's crazy, eh? Well, sir, let me tell you that ain't the worst." Zadok was really screaming now, and the mad frenzy of his voice disturbed me more than I cared to own. "Curse ye, don't set there staring at me with them eyes. I tell Obed Marsh he's in hell, and he's got to stay there. In hell, I says. Can't get me, I ain't done nothing nor told nobody nothing. Oh, you young feller? Well, even if I hadn't told nobody nothing yet, I'm a-going to now. You just set still and listen to me, boy. This is what I ain't never told nobody, and I didn't do no prying at her that night, but I found things out just the same. You want to know what real horror is, hey? Well, this is. It ain't what them fish devils has done, but what they're gonna do. They're bringing up things out of where they come from into town. Been doing it for years and slackening up lately. Them houses north of the river between Water and Main Street's full of them. Them devils and what they brung. When they get ready, I say when they get ready. You ever hear tell of a Shoggoth? Hey, did you hear me? I tell you, I know what them things be. I seen 'em one night when... The hideous suddenness and inhuman frightfulness of the old man's shriek made me faint, almost made me faint. His eyes, looking past me toward the malodorous sea, were positively starting from his head, while his face was a mask of fear worthy of a Greek tragedy. His bony claw dug monstrously into my shoulder, and made no motion as I turned my head at whatever he had glimpsed. There was nothing that I could see. Only the incoming tide, with perhaps one set of ripples more local than the other far-flung line of breakers. But now Zadok was shaking me, and I turned back to watch the melting of that fear-frozen face into a chaos of twitching eyelids and mumbling gums. Presently his voice came back, albeit in a trembling whisper. "Get out of here. Get out of here now. They seen us. Get out for your life. Don't wait for nothing. They know now. Run for it quick. Out of this town." Another heavy wave dashed against the loosening masonry of the bygone wharf and changed the mad ancient whispers to another inhuman blood-curdling scream. Ah! Before I could recover my scattered wits, he had relaxed his clutch on my shoulder and dashed wildly inland towards the street, reeling northward around the ruined warehouse wall. I glanced back at the sea, but there was nothing there. And when I reached Water Street and looked along it toward the north, there was no remaining traces of Zadok Allen. I can hardly describe the mood in which I was left by this harrowing episode. An episode at once mad and pitiful, grotesque and terrifying. The grocery boy had prepared me for it, yet the reality left me none the less bewildered and disturbed. Puerile though the story was, old Zadok's insane earnestness and horror had communicated to me a mounting unrest which joined with my earlier sense of loathing for the town and its blight of intangible shadow. Later I might sift the tale and extract some nucleus of historic allegory. Just now I wished to put it out of my head. The hour had grown perilously late. My watch said 7:15, and the Arkham buffs left town square at 8. So I tried to give my thoughts as neutral as I can, and practiced a cast as possible. Meanwhile, walking rapidly through the deserted streets of gaping roofs and leaning houses towards the hotel where I had checked my valise and would find my bus. Yes, kitty cat. Though the golden light of late afternoon gave the ancient roofs and decrepit chimneys an air of mystic loveliness and peace, I could not help glancing over my shoulder now and then. I would surely be very glad to get out of malodorous and feared shadow Innsmouth, and wished there was some other vehicle than the bus, driven by that sinister-looking fellow sergeant. Yet I did not hurry too precipitously. Precipitately? Whatever. Cat, you're not helping. For there were architectural details worth viewing at every silent corner. And I could easily, I calculated, cover the necessary distance in half an hour. Studying the grocery youth's map and seeking a route I had not traversed before, I chose Marsh Street instead of State for my approach to the town square. Near the corner of Fall Street, I began to see scattered groups of furtive whisperers. When I finally reached the square, I saw that almost all the loiterers were congregated around the door of the Gilman house. It seemed as if many bulging, watering, unwinking eyes looked oddly at me as I claimed my valise in the lobby, and I hoped that none of these unpleasant creatures would be my fellow passengers on the coach. Yes, Metastep, you are very dermy. The bus, rather early, rattled in with 3 passengers somewhat before 8, and an evil-looking fellow on the sidewalk muttered a few indistinguishable words to the driver. Sergeant threw out a mailbag and a roll of newspapers and entered the hotel, while the passengers, the same men whom I had seen arriving in Newport that morning, shambled to the sidewalk and exchanged some faint guttural words with a loafer in a language I could have sworn was not English. I boarded the empty coach and took the same seat I had taken before, but was hardly settled before Sergeant reappeared and began mumbling in a throaty voice of peculiar repulsiveness. I was, it appeared, in very bad luck. There had been something wrong with the engine despite the excellent time made from Newburyport, and the bus could not complete the journey to Arkham. No, it could not possibly be repaired that night, nor was there any other way of getting transportation out of Innsmouth, either to Arkham or elsewhere. Sergeant was sorry, but I would have to stop over at the Gilman. Probably The clerk would make the price easy for me, but there was nothing else to do. Almost dazed by this sudden obstacle and violently dreading the fall of night in this decaying and half unlighted town, I left the bus and re-entered the hotel lobby, where the sullen, queer-looking night clerk told me I could have room 428 on next the top floor, a large, but without running water, for $1. Despite what I had heard of this hotel in Newbury, I signed the register, paid my $1, and let the clerk take my valise and followed that sour, solitary attendant up 3 flights of creaking stairs, past dusty corridors which seemed wholly devoid of life. My room, a dismal rear one with 2 windows and bare, cheap furnishing, overlooked a dingy courtyard otherwise hemmed in by low, deserted brick blocks, and commanded a view of decrepit westward stretches with marshy countryside below. At the end of the corridor was a bathroom, a discouraging relic with ancient marble bowl, tin tub, faint electric light, and musty wooden paneling around all the plumbing fixtures. I better turn that down before he accidentally hits it. It still being daylight, I descended to the square and looked around for a dinner of some sort, noticing as I did so the strange glances. I'm sorry, I'm being harassed by a cat. All right. Do you mind? Noticing as I did so the strange glances I received from the unwholesome loafers. Since the grocery was closed, I was forced to patronize the restaurant I had shunned before. A stooped, narrow-headed man with staring, unwinking eyes, and a flat-nosed wench with unbelievably thick, clumsy hands being in attendance. The service was all of the counter type, and it relieved me to find that much was evidently served from cans and packages. A bowl of vegetable soup with crackers was enough for me, and I soon headed back for my cheerless room at the Gilman, getting an evening paper and a fly-specked magazine from the evil-visaged clerk at the rickety stand beside his desk. As twilight deepened, I turned on the one feeble electric bulb over the cheap iron-framed bed and tried as best I could to continue the reading I had begun. I felt it advisable to keep my mind wholesomely occupied, for it would not do to brood over the abnormalities of this ancient, blight-shadowed town while I was still within its borders. The insane yard I had heard from the ancient drunkard did not promise very pleasant dreams, and I felt I must keep the image of his wild, watery eyes as far as possible from my imagination. Also, I must not dwell on what that factory inspector had told the Newburyport ticket agent about the Gilman house and the voices of its nocturnal tenants. Not on that, nor on the face beneath the tiara in that black church doorway, the face for whose horror my conscious mind could not account. It would perhaps have been easier to keep my thoughts from disturbing topics had the room not been so gruesomely musty. As it was, the lethal mustiness blended hideously with the town's general fishy odors, and persistently focused one's fancy on death and decay. Another thing that disturbed me was the absence of a bolt on the door of my room. Had there been one, or one had been there, as Mark's. I'm fine. I've got a giant-ass black cat crawling on me and pushing me and kneading me, and he's an asshole. Keeps pushing the microphone.
Another thing that disturbed me was the absence of a bolt on the door of my room. One had been there, as the marks clearly shewed, but there were signs of recent removal. No doubt it had become out of order, like so many other things in this decrepit edifice. In my nervousness, I looked around and discovered a bolt on the clothes press, which seemed to be of the same size, judging from the marks, as the one formerly on the door. To gain partial relief from the general tension, I busied myself by transferring this hardware to the vacant place with the aid of a handy 3-in-1 device, including a screwdriver which I kept on my keyring. The bolt fitted perfectly, and I was somewhat relieved when I knew that I could shoot it firmly upon retiring. Not that I had any real apprehension of its need, but that any symbol of security was welcome in an environment of this kind. There was adequate bolts on the 2 lateral doors to the connecting room, and these I proceeded to fasten. I did not undress, but decided to read till I was sleepy, and then lie down with only my coat, collar, and shoes off. Taking a pocket flashlight from my valise, I placed it in my trousers so that I could read my watch if I woke up later in the dark. Drowsiness, however, did not come, and when I stopped to analyze my thoughts, I found to my disquiet that I was really unconsciously listening for something which I dreaded but could not name. The inspector's story must have worked on my imagination more deeply than I had suspected. Again I tried to read, but found that I made no progress. After a time, I seemed to hear the stairs and corridors creak at intervals, as if with footsteps, and wondered if the other rooms were beginning to fill up. There were no voices, however, and it struck me that there was something subtly furtive about the creaking. I did not like it, and debated whether I had better try to sleep at all. This town had some queer people, and there had undoubtedly been several disappearances. Was this one of those inns where travelers were slain for their money? Surely I had no look of excessive prosperity. Or were the town folks really so resentful about curious visitors? Had my obvious sightseeing, with its frequent map consultations, aroused unfavorable notice? It occurred to me that I must be in a highly nervous state to let a few random creakings set me off speculating in this fashion, but I regretted none the less that I was unarmed. At length, the feeling of fatigue which had nothing of drowsiness in it, I bolted the newly outfitted hall door and turned off the light and threw myself down on the hard, uneven bed, coat, collar, shoes, and all. In the darkness, every faint noise of the night seemed magnified, and a flood of doubly unpleasant thoughts swept over me. I was sorry I had put the light out, yet was too tired to rise and turn it on again. Then, after a long, dreary interval, and prefaced by a fresh creaking of stairs and corridor, there came that soft, damnably unmistakable sound which seemed like a malign fulfillment of all my apprehensions. Without the least shadow of doubt, the lock on my hall door was being tried, cautiously, furtively, tentatively, with a key. My sensations upon recognizing the sign of actual peril were perhaps rather less than tumultuous because of my previous vague fears. I had been, albeit without a definite reason, instinctively on my guard. And that was to my advantage in the new and real crisis, whatever it might turn out to be. Nonetheless, the change in the menace from vague premonition to immediate reality was a profound shock, and fell upon me with the force of a genuine blow. It never once occurred to me that the fumbling might be a mere mistake. Malign purpose was all I could think of, and kept deathly quiet, awaiting the would-be intruder's next move. After a time, the cautious rattling ceased, and I heard the room to the north entered with a pass-key. Then the lock of the connecting door to my room was softly tried. The bolt held, of course, and I heard the floor creak as the prowler left the room. After a moment, there came another soft rattling, and I knew that the room to the south of me was being entered. Again, a furtive trying of a bolted connecting door, and again, a receding creaking. This time the creaking went along the hall and down the stairs, so I knew that the prowler had realized the bolted condition of my doors and was giving up his attempt for a greater or lesser time, as the future would shew. The readiness with which I fell into a plan of action proves that I must have been subconsciously fearing some menace and considering possible avenues of escape for hours. From the first, I felt that unseen fumbler meant a danger not to be met or dealt with, but only to be fled from as precipitously as possible. The one thing to do was to get out of that hotel alive as quickly as I could, and through some channel other than the front stairs and lobby. Rising softly and throwing my flashlight on the switch, I sought to light the bulb over my head in order to choose and pocket some of my belongings for a swift, valiseless flight. Nothing, however, happened, and I saw that the power had been cut off. Clearly, some cryptic, evil movement was afoot on a large scale. Just what, I could not say. As I stood pondering with my hand on the now useless switch, I heard a muffled creak on the floor below, as though I could barely distinguish thought I could barely distinguish voices in conversation. A moment later, I felt less sure that the deeper sounds were voices, since the apparent hoarse barkings and loose syllable croakings bore so little resemblance to recognized human speech. Then I thought with renewed force of what the factory inspector had heard in the night in the smoldering and pestilential building. Having filled my pockets with the flashlight's aid, I put on my hat and tiptoed to the windows to consider chances of descent. Despite the state safety regulations, there was no fire escape on this side of the hotel, and I saw that my windows commanded only a sheer three-story drop to the cobbled courtyard. On the right and left, however, some ancient brick businesses blocks abutted to the hotel, their slant roofs coming up to a reasonable jumping distance from my fourth-story level. Where was I? To reach either of these lines of buildings, I would have had to be in a room 2 doors from my own, and in one case on the north, and in the other case on the south. My mind instantly set to work calculating what chances I had of making the transfer. I've actually played The Sinking City some, Genpachi. I could not, I decided, risk an emergence into the corridor where my footsteps would surely be heard, and where the difficulties of entering the desired rooms would be insuperable. My progress, if it was to be made at all, would have to be through the less solidly built connecting doors of the rooms, the locks and bolts of which I would have to force violently using my shoulder as a battering ram whenever they were set against me. This, I thought, would be possible owing to the rickety nature of the house and its fixtures, but I realized I could not do it noiselessly. I would have to count on sheer speed, and the chance of getting to a window before any hostile forces became coordinated enough to open the right door towards me with a pass key. My own outer door I reinforced by pushing up the bureau against it, little by little, in order to make a minimum of sound. I perceived that my chances were very slender, and was fully prepared for any calamity. Even getting to another roof would not solve the problem, for there would then remain the task of reaching the ground and escaping from town. One thing in my favor was the deserted and ruinous states of the abutting buildings and the number of skylights gaping blackly open in each row. Gathering from the groceries boy's map that the best route out of town was southward, I glanced first at the connecting door on the south side of the room. It was designed to open in my direction, hence I saw, after drawing the bolt and finding other fastenings in place. It was not a favorable one for forcing, accordingly abandoning it as a route. I cautiously moved to the bedstand against it to hamper any attack which might be made on it later from the next room. The door on the north was hung to open away from me, and this, though a test proved to be locked or bolted from the other side, I knew must be my route. If I could gain the roofs of the buildings in the Payne Street and descend successfully to the ground, I might perhaps start through the courtyard and the adjacent or opposite buildings to the Washington or Bates, or else emerge in Payne and edge around the southward into Washington. In any case, sorry. In any case, I would aim to strike Washington somehow and get quickly out of the town square region. My preference would be to avoid Payne, since the fire station there might be open all night. As I thought of these things, I looked out over the squalid sea of decaying roofs below me, now brightened by the beams of a moon not much past full. On the right, the black gash of the river gorge clove the panorama, abandoned factories and railway stations clinging barnacle-like to its sides. Beyond it, the rusted railway and the Rowley Road led off through a flat, marshy terrain dotted with islets of higher and drier scrub-grown land. On the left, the creek threaded the countryside. Countryside was nearer. The narrower road to Ipswich gleaming white in the moonlight. I could not see from my side of the hotel the southward road towards Arkham, which I had been determined to take. I was irresolutely speculating on when I had better attack the northward door, and how I could least audibly manage it, when I noticed the vague noises underfoot had given place to a fresh and heavier creaking of the stairs. A wavering flicker of light shooed through my transom, and the boards of the corridors began to groan with a ponderous load. Muffled sounds of possible vocal origin approached, and at length a firm knock came at my outer door. For a moment I simply held my breath and waited. Eternity seemed to elapse, and the nauseous, fishy odor of my environment seemed to mount suddenly and spectacularly. Then the knocking was repeated, continuously and with growing insistence. I knew that the time for action had come, and forthwith drew the bolt of the northward connecting door, bracing myself for the task of battering it open. The knocking waxed louder, and I hoped that its volume would cover the sounds of my effort. At last, beginning my attempt, I lunged again and again at the thin paneling with my left shoulder, heedless of shock or pain. The door resisted even more than I'd expected, but I did not give in. All the while the clamor at the outer door increased. Finally, the connecting door gave, but with such a crash I knew those outside must have heard. Instantly, the outside knocking became a violent battering, while the keys sounded ominously in the hall doors of the rooms on both sides of me. Rushing through the newly opened connection, I succeeded in bolting the northerly hall door before the lock could be turned, but even as I did so, I heard the hall door of the third room, the one from whose window I had hoped to reach the roof below, being tried with the pass key. For an instant I felt absolute despair, since my trapping in a chamber with no window egress seemed complete. A wave of almost abnormal horror swept over me, and invested with a terrible but inexplicable singularity the flashlight glimpsed dust prints made by the intruder who had lately tried my door from this room. Then, with a dazed automatism which persisted despite hopelessness, I made the next connecting door and performed the blind motion of pushing it at it in an effort to get through, and, granting that the fastenings might be provincially intact as the second room, bolt the hall door before the lock could be turned from the outside. Sheer fortunate chance gave me reprieve, for the connecting door before me was not only unlocked, but actually ajar. In a second I was through, and had my right knee and shoulder against the hall door, which was visibly opening inward. My pressure took the opener off guard, for the thing shut as I pushed, so that I could slip the well-conditioned bolt, as I had done with the other door. As I gained this respite, I heard the battering at the two other doors abate, while a confused clatter came from the connecting door I had shielded with the bedstead. Evidently, the bulk of my assailants had entered the southerly room and were massing in a lateral attack. But at the same moment, the pass key sounded in the next door to the north, and I knew a nearer peril was at hand. The northward connecting door was wide open, but there was no time to think about checking the already turning lock in the hall. All I could do was shut and bolt the open connecting door, as well as its mate on the opposite side. Pushing a bedstead against one and a bureau against the other, I moved a washstand in front of the hall door. I must, I saw, trust to such makeshift barriers to shield me till I could get out the window and on the roof of the Payne Street block. But even in this acute moment, my chief horror was something apart from the immediate weakness of my defenses. I was shuddering because not one of my pursuers, despite some hideous panting, grunting, and subdued barking at odd intervals, was uttering an unmuffled or intelligible vocal sound. As I moved the furniture and rushed towards the windows, I heard a frightful scurrying along the corridor towards the room north of me, and perceived that the southward battering had ceased. Plainly, most of my opponents were about to concentrate against the feeble connecting door which they knew must open directly on me. Outside, the moon played on the ridgepole of the block below, and I saw that the jump would be desperately hazardous because of the steep surface on which I must land. Surveying the conditions, I chose the more southerly of the two windows as my avenue of escape, planning to land on the inner slope of the roof and make for the nearest skylight. Once inside one of the decrepit brick structures, I would have to reckon with pursuit, but I hoped to descend and dodge in and out of the yawning doorways along the shadowed courtyard, eventually getting to Washington Street and slipping out of town towards the south. The clatter at the northerly connecting door was now terrific, and I saw that the weak paneling was beginning to splinter. Obviously, the besiegers had brought some ponderous object into play as a battering ram. The bedstead, however, still held firm, so that I had at least a faint chance of making good my escape. As I opened the window, I noticed that it was flanked by a heavy velour drapery suspended from a pole by brass rings, and also that there was a large projecting catch from the shutters on the exterior. Seeing a possible means of avoiding the dangerous jump, I yanked at the hangings and brought them down, pole and all, then quickly hooking 2 rings in the shutter catch and flinging the drapery outside. The heavy folds reached fully to the abutting roof, and I saw that the rings and catch would be likely to bear my weight. So climbing out of the window and down the improvised ladder, I left behind me forever the morbid and horror-infested fabric of the Gilman house. I landed safely on the loose slopes of the steep roof and succeeded in gaining the gaping black skylight without a slip. Glancing up at the window I had left, I observed it was still dark, though far across the crumbling chimneys to the north I could see the lights ominously blazing in the order of Dagon Hall, the Baptist Church, and the Congregational Church, which I had recalled so shiveringly. There had seemed to be no one in the courtyard below, and I had hoped there would be a chance to get away before the spreading of a general alarm. Flashing my pocket lamp into the skylight, I saw that there were no steps down. The distance was slight, however, so I clambered over the brink and dropped, striking a dusty floor littered with crumbling boxes and barrels. The place was ghoulish looking, but I was past minding such impressions and made at once for the staircase revealed by my flashlight. After a hasty glance at my watch, which shewed the hour to be 2 a.m., the steps creaked and seemed tolerably sound, and I raced down past the barn-like second story to the ground floor. The desolation was complete, and only echoes answered my footfalls. At length I reached the lower hall, at one end of which I saw a faint, luminous rectangle marking the ruined Payne Street doorway. Heading the other way, I found the back door also open, and darted out and down 5 stone steps to the grass-grown cobblestones of the courtyard. The moonbeams did not reach down here, but I could just see my way without using the flashlight. Some of the windows on the Gilman house side were faintly glowing, and I thought I heard confused sounds within. Walking softly to the Washington Street side, I perceived several open doorways, and chose the nearest as my route out. The hallway inside was black, and when I reached the opposite end, I saw the street door was wedged immovably shut. Resolved to try another building, I groped my way back toward the courtyard, but stopped short when close to the doorway. For out of an open door in the Gilman house, a large crowd of doubtful shapes was pouring, lanterns bobbing in the darkness, and horrible croaking voices exchanging low cries in what was certainly not English. The figures moved uncertainly, and I realized to my relief that they did not know where I had gone, but for all that they sent a shiver of horror through my frame. Their features were indistinguishable, but their crouching, shambling gaits was abnormally repellent. And worst of all, I perceived that one figure was strangely robed and unmistakably surmounted by a tall tiara of design altogether too familiar. As the figures spread throughout the courtyard, I felt my fears increase. Suppose I could find no egress from this building on the street side. The fishy odor was detestable, and I wondered I could stand it without fainting. Again, groping toward the street, I opened a door off the hall and came upon an empty room with closely shuttered but sashless windows. Fumbling in the rays of my flashlight, I found I could open the shutters, and in another moment had climbed outside and was carefully closing the aperture in its original manner. I was now in Washington Street, and for the moment saw no living thing nor any light save that of the moon. From several directions in the distance, however, I could hear the sound of hoarse voices, of footsteps, and of a curious kind of pattering which did not sound quite like footsteps. Plainly, I had no time to lose. The points of the compass were clear to me, and I was glad that all the streetlights were turned off, as is often custom on strongly moonlit nights in unprosperous rural regions. Some of the sounds came from the south, yet I retained my design of escaping in that direction. There would, I knew, be plenty of deserted doorways to shelter me in case I met any persons or group who looked like pursuers. I walked rapidly, softly, and close to the ruined houses. While hatless and disheveled after my arduous climb, I did not look especially noticeable, and stood a good chance of passing unheeded if forced to encounter any casual wayfarer. At Bates Street, I drew into a yawning vestibule, while 2 shambling figures crossed in front of me, but was soon on my way again, and approaching the open space where Elliott Street obliquely crosses Washington, at the intersection of South. Though I had never seen this space, it had looked dangerous to me on the grocery use map, since the moonlight would have free play there. There was no use trying to evade it, for any alternative course would involve detours of possibly disastrous visibility and delaying effect. The only thing to do was to cross it boldly and openly, imitating the typical shamble of the Innsmouth folk as best I could, and trusting that no one, or at least no pursuer of mine, would be there. Just how fully the pursuit was organized, and indeed, just what purpose just what its purpose might be, I could form no idea. There seemed to be unusual activity in the town, but I judged that the news of my escape from the Gilman had not yet spread. I would, of course, soon have to shift from Washington to some other southward street, for that party from the hotel would doubtless be after me. I must have left dust prints in that last old building, revealing how I had gained the streets. The open space was, as I had expected, strongly moonlit, and as I saw the remains of a park-like iron-railed green in its center. Fortunately, no one was about, though a curious sort of buzz or roar seemed to be increasing in the direction of Town Square. South Street was very wide, leading directly down a slight declivity to the waterfront and commanding a long view out at sea. I hoped that no one would be glancing up at it from afar as I crossed the bright moonlight. My progress was unimpeded, and no fresh sound arose to hint that I had been spied. Glancing about me, I involuntarily let my pace slacken for a second to take in the sight of the sea, gorgeous in the burning moonlight at the street's end. Far beyond the breakwater was the dim, dark line of the Devil's Reef, and as I glimpsed it, I could not help thinking of all the hideous legends I had heard in the last 34 hours. Legends which portrayed this ragged rock as a veritable gateway to realms of unfathomed horror and inconceivable abnormality. Then, without warning, I saw the intermittent flashes of light on the distant reef. They were definite and unmistakable, and awaked in my mind a blind horror beyond all rational proportion. My muscles tightened for a panic flight, held only by a certain unconscious caution and half-hypnotic fascination. And to make matters worse, there now flashed forth from the lofty cupola of the Gilman house, which loomed up to the northeast behind me, a series of analogous, though differently spaced gleams, which could be nothing less than an answering signal. Controlling my muscles, and realizing afresh how plainly visible I was, I resumed my brisker and framed shambling pace, though keeping my eyes on that hellish and ominous reef as long as the opening of the South Street gave me a seaward view. What the whole proceeding meant, I could not imagine, unless it involved some strange rite connected with the Devil Reef, or unless some party had landed from a ship on that sinister rock. I now bent to the left around the ruinous green, still gazing towards the ocean as it blazed in the spectral summer moonlight, and watching the cryptical flashing of those nameless, unexplainable beacons. It was then that the most horrible impression of all was borne in upon me. The impression which destroyed my last vestige of self-control and set me running frantically southward past the yawning black doorways and fishily staring windows of that deserted nightmare street. For at a closer glance, I saw that the moonlit waters between the reef and the shore were far from empty. They were alive with a teeming horde of shapes swimming inward toward the town. And even at my vast distance, and in my single moment of perception, I could tell that the bobbing heads and flailing arms were alien and aberrant, and in a way scarcely to be expressed or consciously formulated. My frantic running ceased before I had covered a block, for at my left I began to hear something like the hue and cry of organized pursuit. There were footsteps and guttural sounds, and a rattling motor wheezed along Federal Street. In a second all of my plans were utterly changed, for if the southward highway were blocked ahead of me, I must clearly find another egress from Innsmouth. I paused and drew into a gaping doorway, reflecting how lucky I was to have left the moonlit open space before these pursuers came down the parallel street. A second reflection was less comforting. Since the pursuit was down another street, and it was plainly the party was not following me directly. It had not seen me, but was simply obeying a general plan of cutting off my escape. This, however, implied that all roads leading out of Innsmouth were similarly patrolled, for the Desens could not have known what route I intended to take. If this were so, I would have to make my retreat across country away from any road. But how could I do that in view of the marshy, creek-riddled nature of all the surrounding region? For a moment my brain reeled, both from sheer hopelessness and from a rapid increase in the omnipresent fishy odor. Then I thought of the abandoned railway to Rowley, whose solid line of balustered weed-grown earth still stretched off to the northwest from the crumbling station on the edge of the river gorge. There was just a chance that the townsfolk would not think of that, since its briar-choked desertion made it half impassable, and the unlikeliest of all avenues for a fugitive to choose. I had seen it clearly from my hotel window, and knew about how it lay. Most of its earlier length was uncomfortably visible from the Rowley Road and from high places in the town itself, but one could perhaps crawl inconspicuously through the undergrowth. At any rate, it would form my only chance of deliverance, and there was nothing to do but try it. Drawing inside the hall of my deserted shelter, I once more consulted the grocery boy's map with the aid of the flashlight. The immediate problem was how to reach the ancient railway, and I now saw the safest course was ahead to Babson Street, then west to Lafayette, there edging around but not crossing an open square homologous with the one I had traversed, and subsequently back northward and westward in a zigzagging line through Lafayette, Bates, Adams, and Bank Streets, the latter skirting the river gorge, to the abandoned and dilapidated station where I had seen from my window. My reason for going ahead to Babson was that I wished neither to recross the earlier open space nor to begin my westward course along a cross street as broad as south. Starting once more, I crossed the street to the right-hand side in order to edge around into Babson as inconspicuously as possible. Noises still continued in Federal Street. As I glanced behind me, I thought I saw a gleam of light near the building through which I had escaped. Anxious to leave Washington Street, I broke into a quiet dog trot, trusting to luck not to encounter any observing eye. Next, the corner of Babson Street. I saw, to my alarm, that one of the houses was still inhabited, as attested by the curtains at the windows, but there were no lights within, and I passed it without disaster. In Babson Street, which crossed Federal, and thus might reveal me to searchers, I clung as closely as possible to the sagging, uneven buildings, twice pausing in a doorway as the noises behind me momentarily increased. The open space ahead shone wide and desolate under the moon, but my route would not force me to cross it. During my second pause, I began to detect a fresh distribution of vague sounds, and upon looking cautiously out from cover, beheld a motor car darting across the open space, bound outward along Elliott Street, which there intersects both Babson and Lafayette. As I watched, choked by a sudden rise in the fishy odor after a short abatement, I saw a band of uncouth, crouching shapes loping and shambling in the same direction, and knew that this must be the party guarding the Ipswich Road, since that highway forms an extension of Elliott Street. Two of the figures I glimpsed were in voluminous robes, and one wore a peaked diadem, which glistened whitely in the moonlight. The gait of this figure was so odd that it sent a chill through me, for it seemed to me the creature was almost hopping. When the last of the band was out of sight, I resumed my progress, darting around the corner into Lafayette Street, crossing Elliott very hurriedly, lest stragglers of the party be still advancing along that thoroughfare. I did hear some croaking and clattering sounds far off towards Town Square, but accomplished the passage without disaster. My greatest dread was in recrossing broad and moonlit South Street, with its seaward view, and I had to nerve myself for the ordeal. Someone might easily be looking, and possible Elliott Street stragglers could not fail to glimpse me from either of the 2 points. At the last moment, I decided I'd better slacken my trot and make the crossing before the shambling gait, as before in the shambling gait of the average Innsmouth native. When the view of the water again opened out, this time on my right, I was half determined not to look at it at all. I could not, however, resist but cast a sidelong glance as I carefully and imitatively shambled toward the protecting shadows ahead. There was no ship visible, as I had half expected there would be. Instead, the first thing which caught my eye was a small rowboat pulling in towards the abandoned wharves and laden with some bulky, tarpaulin-covered object. Its rowers, though distantly and indistinctly seen, were of an especially repellent aspect. Several swimmers were still discernible, while on the far black reef I could see a faint, steady glow, unlike the winking beacon visible before, and of a curious color which I could not precisely identify. Above the slant roofs ahead and to the right, there loomed the tall cupola of the Gilman house, but it was completely dark. The fishy odor, dispelled for a moment by some merciful breeze, now closed in again with maddening intensity. I had not quite crossed the street when I heard a muttering band advancing along Washington from the north. As they reached the broad open space where I had my first disquieting glimpse of the moonlit water, I could see them plainly only a block away, and was horrified by the bestial abnormality of their faces and the dog-like subhumanness of their crouching gait. One man moved in a positively simian way, with the long arms frequently touching the ground, while another figure, robed and tiaraed, seemed to progress in an almost hopping fashion. I judged this party to be the one I had seen in the Gilman courtyard, the one, therefore, most closely on my trail. As some of the figures turned to look in my direction, I was transfixed with fright, yet managed to preserve the casual, shambling gait I had assumed. To this day, I do not know whether they saw me or not. If they did, my stratagem must have deceived them, for they passed on across the moonlit space without varying their course, meanwhile croaking and jabbering in some hateful guttural patois I could not identify. Hi, Dave. Once more in shadow, I resumed my former dog trot past the leaning and decrepit houses that stared blankly into the night. Having crossed to the western sidewalk, I rounded the nearest corner into Bates Street, where I kept close to the buildings on the southern side. I passed 2 houses showing sign of habitation, one of which had faint lights in the upper rooms, yet met with no obstacle. As I turned into Adams Street, I felt measurably safer, but received a shock when a man reeled out of a black doorway directly in front of me. He proved, however, too hopelessly drunk to be a menace, so that I reached the dismal ruins of the Bank Street warehouses in safety. No one was stirring in that dead street beside the river gorge, and the roar of the waterfalls quite drowned my footsteps. It was a long dog trot to the ruined station, and the great brick warehouse walls around me seemed somehow more terrifying than the fronts of the private houses. At last I saw the ancient arcaded station, or what was left of it, and made directly for the tracks that started from its further end. The rails were rusty but mainly intact, and not more than half the ties had rotted away. Walking or running on such a surface was very difficult, but I did my best, and on the whole made very fair time. For some distance the line kept on going along the gorge's brink, but at length I reached the long covered bridge, where it crossed the chasm at a dizzying height. The condition of this bridge would determine my next step. If humanly possible, I would use it. If not, I would have to risk more street wandering, and take the nearest intact highway bridge. The vast barn-like length of the old bridge gleamed spectrally in the moonlight, and I saw that the ties were safe for at least a few feet within. Entering, I began to use my flashlight, and was almost knocked down by the cloud of bats that flapped past me. About halfway across, there was a perilous gap in the ties, which I feared for a moment would halt me. But in the end, I risked a desperate jump, which I fortunately succeeded. I was glad to see the moonlight again when I emerged from that macabre tunnel. The old tracks crossed the river street at a grade, and at once veered off into the region increasingly rural, and with less and less of the Innsmouth abhorrent fishy odor. Here, the dense growth of weeds and briars hindered me and cruelly tore my clothes, but I was none the less glad that they were there to give me concealment in case of peril. I knew that much of my route must be visible from the rolly road. The marsh region began very shortly, with the single track on a low, grassy embankment where the reedy growth was somewhat thinner. Then came a sort of island of a higher ground, where the line passed through a shallow open cut choked with bushes and brambles. I was very glad of this partial shelter, since at this point the Rowley Road was uncomfortably near according to my window view. At the end of the cut, it would cross the track and swerve off to a safer distance, but meanwhile I must be exceedingly careful. I was by this time thankfully certain that the railway itself was not patrolled. Just before entering the cut, I glanced behind me but saw no pursuer. The ancient spires and roofs of decaying Innsmouth gleamed lovely and ethereal in the magic yellow moonlight, and I thought of how they must have looked in the old days before the shadow fell. Then, as my gaze circled inland from the town, something less tranquil arrested my notice and held me immobile for a second. What I saw, or fancied I saw, was a disturbing suggestion of undulant movement far to the south. A suggestion which made me conclude that a very large horde must be pouring out of the city along the level Ipswich Road. The distance was great, and I could distinguish nothing in detail, but I did not at all like the look of that moving column. It undulated too much, and glistened too brightly in the rays of the now westering moon. There was a suggestion of sound, too, though the wind was blowing the other way. Suggestion of bestial scraping and bellowing even worse than the muttering of the parties I had lately overheard. All sorts of unpleasant conjectures crossed my mind, and I thought of those very extreme Innsmouth types said to be hidden in crumbling, centuried warrens near the waterfront. I thought, too, of those nameless swimmers I had seen. Counting the parties so far glimpsed, as well as those presumably covering other roads, the number of my pursuers must be strangely large for a town as depopulated as Innsmouth. Whence could come the dense personnel of such a column as I now beheld? Did those ancient, unplumbed warrens teem with a twisted, uncatalogued, and unsuspected life? Or had some unseen ship indeed landed a legion of unknown outsiders on that hellish reef? Who were they? Why were they there? And if such a column of them was scouring the Ipswich Road, would the patrols on the other roads be likewise augmented? I had entered the brush-grown cut, and was struggling along at a very slow pace when that damnable fishy odor again waxed dominant. Had the wind suddenly changed eastward so that it blew in from the sea and over the town? It must have, I concluded, since I now began to hear the shocking guttural murmurs from that hitherto silent direction. There was another sound, too, a kind of wholesale colossal flopping or pattering, which somehow called up the image of the most detestable sort. It made me think illogically of that unpleasantly undulating column on the far-off Ipswich Road. And then both the stench and sounds grew stronger, so that I paused shivering and grateful for the cut's protection. It was here, I recalled, that the Rowley Road grows so close to the railroad before crossing westward and diverging. Something was coming along the road, and I must lie low till its passage and vanishment. And I must lie low till its passage and vanishment in the distance. Thank heaven these creatures employed no dogs for tracking, though perhaps that would have been impossible amidst the omnipresent regional odor. Crouched in the bushes of that sandy cleft, I felt reasonably safe, even though I knew the searchers would have to cross the track in front of me, not much more than by 100 yards away. I would be able to see them, but they could not, except by a malign miracle, see me. All at once I began dreading to look at them as they passed. I saw the close moonlit space where they would surge by, and had curious thoughts about the irredeemable pollution of that space. They would perhaps be the worst of all Innsmouth type, something one would not care to remember. The stench waxed overpowering, and the noise swelled to a bestial babble of croaking, baying, and barking, without the least suggestion of human speech. Were these indeed the voices of my pursuers? Did they have dogs after all? So far as I had seen none of the lower animals in Innsmouth. That flopping or pattering was monstrous. I could not look upon the degenerate creatures responsible for it. I would keep my eyes shut till the sounds receded toward the west. The horde was very close now. The air foul with their hoarse snarlings, and the ground almost shaking with their alien rhythmed footfalls. My breath nearly ceased to come, and I put every ounce of willpower into the task of holding down my eyelids. I am not even willing to say whether what followed was a hideous actuality or only a nightmare hallucination. The latter action of the government, after my frantic appeals, would tend to confirm it as monstrous truth. But could not a hallucination have been repeated under the quasi-hypnotic spell of that ancient, haunted, and shadowed town? Such places have strange properties, and the legacy of insane legend might well have acted on more than one human imagination amidst those dead, stench-cursed streets and huddles of rotting roofs and crumbling steeples. It is not possible that the germ of an actual contagious madness lurks in the depths of the shadows over Innsmouth. Who can be sure of the reality after hearing things like the tale of old Zadok Allen? The government men never found poor Zadok, and have no conjectures to make as to what became of him. Where does the madness leave off and reality begin? Is it possible that even my latest fear is sheer delusion? I must try to tell what I thought I saw that night under the mocking yellow moon, saw surging and hopping down the Rowley Road in plain sight in front of me as I crouched among the wild brambles of that desolate railway cut. Of course, my resolution to keep my eyes shut had failed. It was foredoomed to failure. For who could crouch blindly while a legion of croaking, baying entities of unknown source flopped noisomely past, scarcely more than 100 yards away? I thought I was prepared for the worst, and I really ought to have been prepared considering what I had seen before. My other pursuers had been accursedly abnormal. Should I not have been ready to face a strengthening of the abnormal element, to look upon forms in which there was no mixture of the normal at all? I did not open my eyes until the raucous clamor came loudly from a point obviously straight ahead. Then I knew that a long section of them must be plainly in sight, where the sides of the cut flattened out and the road crossed the track. And I could no longer keep myself from sampling whatever horror that leering yellow moonlight might have to show. It was the end for whatever remains to me of life on the surface of this earth, of every vestige of mental peace and confidence in the integrity of nature and of the human mind. Nothing I could have imagined, nothing even that I could have gathered I had credited old Zadok's crazy tale in the most literal way, would be in any way comparable to the demonic, blasphemous reality that I saw, or believe I saw. I have tried to hint what it was in order to postpone the horror of writing it down baldly. Can it be possible that this planet has actually spawned such things that humans' eyes have truly seen as objective flesh, what man has hitherto known only in febrile fantasy and tenuous legend? And yet I saw them in a limitless stream, flopping, hopping, croaking, bleeding, surging inhumanly through the spectral moonlight in a grotesque, malignant saraband of fantastic nightmare. Some of them had tall tiaras of that nameless whitish gold metal, and some were strangely robed, and one, who led the way, was clad in a ghoulishly humped black coat and striped trousers, and had a man's felt hat perched on the shapeless thing that answered for a head. I think their predominant color was grayish-green, though they had white bellies. They were mostly shiny and slippery, but the ridges of their backs were scaly. Their forms vaguely suggested the anthropoid, while their heads were the heads of fish, with prodigious bulging eyes that never closed. At the sides of their necks were palpating gills, and their long paws were webbed. They hopped irregularly, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4. I was somehow glad that they had no more than 4 limbs. Their croaking, braying voices, clearly used for articulate speech, held all the darkened shades of expression with which their staring faces lacked. But for all their monstrousness, they were not unfamiliar to me. I knew too well what they must be. For was not the memory of that evil tiara at Newburyport still fresh? They were the blasphemous fish frogs of the nameless design, living and horrible. As I saw them, I knew also of what that humped tiaraed priest at the back church basement had so fearsomely reminded me. Their number was past guessing. It seemed to me that there were limitless swarms of them, and certainly my momentary glimpse could have shewn only the least fraction. In another instant, everything was blotted out by a merciful fit of fainting, the first I had ever had. Hey, artificial cutie. Sorry, we are reading Shadow over Innsmouth tonight. We may be calling it a night here real quick. Let me see how long this next section is. Let's see if my voice will get through it. Oh. Yeah, we can just wrap this story up tonight. It's not too long. Which means next time we will be reading The Dreams in the Witch House, so that'll be fun. Yeah, my voice is fine. It's just, you read for 2 hours straight, you get a little croaky. That's why I drink the tea. Yep, I have tea, I have water. I got both. This throat coat I've got really, really helps. The water helps more with the inside of my mouth, so I stumble less when I'm reading. All right, let's wrap this up, guys. It was a gentle daylight rain that awakened me from my stupor in the brush-grown railway cut, and when I staggered out to the roadway ahead, I saw no trace of any prints in the fresh mud. The fishy odor, too, was gone. Innsmouth ruined roofs and toppling steeples loomed up grayly toward the southeast, but not a living creature did I spy in all the desolate salt marshes around. My watch was still going, and told me that the hour was past noon. The reality of what I had been through was highly uncertain in my mind, but I felt that something hideous lay in the background. I must get away from the evil-shadowed Innsmouth, and accordingly I began to test my cramped, wearied powers of locomotion. Despite weakness, hunger, horror, and bewilderment, I found myself after a time able to walk, so started slowly along the muddy road to Rowley. Before evening I was in the village, getting a meal and providing myself with presentable clothes. I caught the night train to Arkham, and the next day talked long and earnestly with government officials there, a process I later repeated in Boston. With the main result of these colloquies in the public is now familiar, and I wish for normality's sake there was nothing more to tell. Perhaps it is madness that is overtaking me, yet perhaps a greater horror, or a greater marvel, is reaching out. As may well be imagined, I gave up most of the foreplanned features of the rest of my tour, the scenic, architectural, and antiquarian diversions on which I had counted so heavily. Nor did I dare look for that piece of strange jewelry said to be in the Miskatonic University Museum. I did, however, improve my stay in Arkham by collecting some genealogical notes I had long wished to possess. Very rough and hasty data, it is true, but capable of good use later on, when I might have time to collate and codify them. The curator of the Historical Society there, Mr. E. Lapham Peabody, was very courteous about assisting me, and expressed unusual interest when I told him I was a grandson of Eliza Orne of Arkham, who was born in 1867 and had married James Williamson of Ohio at the age of 17. It seemed that a maternal uncle of mine had been there many years before on a quest much like my own, and that my grandfather's family was a topic of some local curiosity. There had, Mr. Peabody said, been considerable discussion about the marriage of her father, Benjamin Orne, just after the Civil War, since the ancestry of the bride was peculiarly puzzling. The bride was understood to have been an orphaned Marsh of New Hampshire, a cousin of the Essex County Marshes, but her education had been in France, and she knew very little of her family. A guardian had deposited funds in a Boston bank account to maintain her and her French governess, but that guardian's name was unfamiliar to Arkham people, and in the time he dropped out of sight, so that the governess assumed his role by court appointment. The Frenchwoman, now long dead, was very taciturn, and there were those who said she could have told more than she did. The most baffling thing was the inability of anyone to place the recorded parents of the young woman, Enoch and Lydia Meserve Marsh, among the known families of New Hampshire. Possibly, many suggested, she was the natural daughter of some Marsh of prominence. She certainly had the true Marsh eyes. Most of the puzzling was done after her early death, which took place at the birth of my grandmother, her only child. Having formed some disagreeable impressions connected with the name of Marsh, I did not welcome the news that it belonged to my own ancestral tree, nor was I pleased by Mr. Peabody's suggestion that I had the true Marsh eyes myself. However, I was grateful for data which I knew would prove valuable, and took copious notes and lists of books regarding the well-documented Orne family. I went directly home to Toledo from Boston, and later spent a month at Maumee recuperating from my ordeal. In September, I entered Oberlin for my final year, and from then till next June was busy with studies and other wholesome activities. Reminded of the bygone terror only by occasional visits from government men in connection with the campaign which my pleas and evidence had started. Around the middle of July, just a year after the Innsmouth experience, I spent a week with my late mother's family in Cleveland, checking some of my new genealogical data with the various notes, traditions, and bits of heirloom material in existence there, and seeing what kind of connected chart I could construct. I did not exactly relish this task, for the atmosphere of the Williamson home had always depressed me. There was a strain of morbidity there, and my mother had never encouraged my visiting her parents as a child, although she always welcomed her father when he came to Toledo. My Arkham-born grandmother had seemed strange and almost terrifying to me, and I do not think I grieved when she disappeared. I was 8 years old then, and it was said that she had wandered off in grief after the suicide of my Uncle Douglas, her eldest son. He had shot himself after a trip to New England, the same trip, no doubt, which had caused him to be recalled at the Arkham Historical Society. This uncle had resembled her, and I had never liked him either. Something about the staring, unwinking expressions of them both had given me a vague, unaccountable uneasiness. My mother and Uncle Walter had not looked like that. They were like their father, though poor little cousin Lawrence, Walter's son, had been an almost perfect duplicate of his grandmother before his condition took him to the permanent seclusion of a sanitarium at Canton. I had not seen him in 4 years, but my uncle once implied that his state, both mental and physical, was very bad. This worry had probably been a major cause of his mother's death 2 years before. My grandfather and his widowed son, Walter, now comprised the Cleveland household, but the memory of older times hung thickly over it. I still disliked the place, and tried to get my researches done as quickly as possible. Williamson records and traditions were supplied in abundance by my grandfather, though for ore material I had to depend on my Uncle Walter, who put at my disposal the contents of all his files, including notes, letters, cuttings, heirlooms, photographs, and miniatures. It was in going over the letters and pictures on the Orange side that I began to acquire a kind of terror of my own ancestry. As I had said, my grandmother and Uncle Douglas had always disturbed me. Now, years after their passing, I gazed at their pictures with a measurably heightened feeling of repulsion and alienation. I could not at first understand the change, but gradually a horrible sort of comparison began to intrude itself on my unconscious mind, despite the steady refusal of my consciousness to admit even the least suspicion of it. It was clear that the typical expression of these faces now suggested something it had not suggested before, something which would bring stark panic if too openly thought of. The worst shock came when my uncle shewed to me the orange jewelry in a downtown deposit safe vault. Some of the items were delicate and inspiring enough, but there was one box of strange old plate pieces descended from my mysterious great-grandmother, which my uncle was almost reluctant to produce. They were, he said, of very grotesque and almost repulsive design, and had never to his knowledge been publicly worn, though my grandmother used to enjoy looking at them. Vague legends of bad luck clustered around them, and my great-grandmother's French governess had said they ought not to be worn in New England, though it would be quite safe to wear them in Europe. As my uncle began slowly and grudgingly to unwrap the things, he urged me not to be shocked by the strangeness and frequent hideousness of the designs. Artists and archaeologists who had seen them pronounced the workmanship superlatively and exotically exquisite, though no one seemed able to define their exact material or assign them to any specific art tradition. There were 2 armlets, a tiara, and a kind of pictorial, the latter having a high relief certain in high relief certain figures of almost unbearable extravagance. During this description, I had kept a tight rein on my emotions, but my face must have betrayed my mounting fears. My uncle looked concerned and paused in his unwrapping to study my countenance. I motioned him to continue, which he did with renewed signs of reluctance. He seemed to expect some demonstration when the first piece, the tiara, became visible, but I doubt if he expected quite what actually happened. I did not expect it either, for I thought I was thoroughly forewarned regarding what the jewelry would turn out to be. What I did was to faint silently away, just as I had done in that briar-choked railway cut a year before. From that day on, my life has been a nightmare of brooding and apprehension. Nor do I know how much is hideous truth and how much madness. My great-grandmother had been a Marsh of unknown source, whose husband lived in Arkham. And did not old Zadok say the daughter of Obed Marsh, by a monstrous mother, was married to an Arkham man through a trick? What was it the ancient toper had muttered about the likeness of my eyes to Captain Obed's? In Arkham, too. The curator told me I had the true Marsh eyes. Was Obed Marsh my own great-great-grandfather who, or what, then was my great-great-grandmother? But perhaps this was all madness. Those whitish gold ornaments might easily have been bought from some Innsmouth sailor by the father of my great-great-grandmother, whoever he was. And that look in the staring-eyed faces of my grandmother and self-slain uncle might be sheer fancy on my part, sheer fancy bolstered up by the Innsmouth shadow which had so darkly colored my imagination. But why had my uncle killed himself after an ancestral quest in New England? For more than 2 years, I fought off these reflections with partial success. My father secured me a place in an insurance office, and I buried myself in routine as deeply as possible. In the winters of 1930 to 31, however, the dreams began. They were very sparse and insidious at first, but increased in frequency and vividness as the weeks went by. Great watery spaces opened out before me, and I seemed to wander through titanic sunken porticos and labyrinths of weedy cyclopean walls with grotesque fishes as my companions. Then the other shapes began to appear, filling me with nameless horror the moment I awoke. But during the dreams they did not horrify me at all. I was one with them, wearing their inhuman trappings, treading their aqueous ways, and praying monstrously at their evil sea-bottom temples. There was much more than I could remember, but even what I did remember each morning would be enough to stamp me as a madman or a genius if I ever dared write it down. Some frightful influence, I felt, was seeking gradually to drag me out of the sane world of wholesome life into unnameable abysses of black and alienage, and the process told heavily on me. My health and appearance grew steadily worse. So finally I was forced to give up my position and adopt the static, secluded life of an invalid. Some odd nervous affliction had me in its grip, and at times I found myself almost unable to shut my eyes. It was then that I began to study the mirror with mounting alarm. The slow ravages of disease are not pleasant to watch, but in my case there was something subtler and more puzzling in the background. My father seemed to notice it too, for he began looking at me curiously, almost affrightedly. What was taking place in me? Could it be that I was becoming to resemble my grandmother and Uncle Douglas? One night I had a frightful dream in which I met my grandmother under the sea. She lived in a phosphorescent palace of many terraces, with gardens of strange leprous coral and grotesque brychiate florences, and welcomed me with a warmth that may have been sardonic. She had changed, as those who take to the water change, and told me she had never died. Instead, she had gone to a spot her dead son had learned about, and leaped into a realm those wonders, destined for him as well, he had spurned with a smoking pistol. This was to be my realm, too. I could not escape it. I would never die, but would live with those who had lived since, before man ever walked the earth. I met also that which had been her grandfather. For 80,000 years, Pthaile had lived in Yanatlithe, and thither she had gone back after Obed Marsh was dead. Yahanithle was not destroyed when the upper earthmen shot death into the sea. It was hurt, but not destroyed. The deep ones could never be destroyed, even though the Paleogean magic of the forgotten old ones might sometimes check them. For the present, they would rest, but someday, if they remembered, they would rise again for the tribute great Cthulhu craved. It would be a city greater than Innsmouth next time. They had planned to spread and had brought up that which would help them, but now they must wait once more. For bringing the upper earth's men death, I must do a penance, but that would not be heavy. This was the dream in which I saw a Shoggoth for the first time, and the sight set me awake in a frenzy of screaming. That morning the mirror definitely told me I had acquired the Innsmouth look. So far I have not shot myself as Uncle Douglas did. I bought an automatic and almost took the step, but certain dreams deterred me. The tense extremes of horror are lessening, and I feel queerly drawn toward the unknown sea deeps instead of fearing them. I hear and do strange things in sleep, and awake with a kind of exaltation instead of terror. I do not believe I need to wait for the full change as most have waited. If I did, my father would probably shut me up in a sanitarium as my poor little cousin is shut up. Stupendous and unheard of splendors await me below, and I shall seek them soon. I relay Cthulhu Fatagan, yeah. No, I shall not suit myself. I cannot be made to shoot myself. I shall plan my cousin's escape from that Canton madhouse, and together we shall go to the marvel-shadowed Innsmouth. We shall swim out to the brooding reefs in the sea, and dive down through the black abysses to Cyclopean and many-column Yahanathe. And in the lair of the deep ones we shall dwell amidst the wonder and glory forever. The end. How long is this? I'm running out of stories here, guys. I might have to buy another book. All right, so that means, like I said, next week we will start The Dreams in the Witch House. From the look of the length, I would say it'll probably take us... I might be able to read it in one go, actually. It doesn't look that long. So... but that's next Thursday. Oh. I hope you all enjoyed the story. If anyone's interested in leaving a tip, you can always donate through YouTube or Coffee, or not required in any way, but yeah, I figured I'd mention it. Coffee's right there on the screen in case you're wondering. Tomorrow night I will be playing some Nightingale. Saturday I will be playing Neverwinter Nights. Sunday I'll be playing Nightingale. I have the singular stream where I become a human for the night on Monday with my dear friend Starsound, where we will bitch about people and animals and everything else. Well, less bitching about the animals, but plenty of bitching about people. Yeah, so thank you all again so much for being here. I genuinely appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll catch you guys tomorrow night. Have some sweet dreams. Stick around for the credits. And thank you to everybody who supports me. I genuinely appreciate all of you. Have a good night, and thanks again. Sorry, I think I need to turn down the transition sound. I will fix that later. Thanks, guys. Good night.